Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around we're going to talk about a volcano in Indonesia and how it changed science fiction and horror cinema forever, even though the thing that the volcano did happened in 1815. Yeah, I know that sounds obscure, but in 1815, a volcano called Tambora in one of the islands of Indonesia exploded. Better than Krakatoa east of Java, at least the movie part of it. So this volcano goes off and throws up dust and ash and everything like that. And in the summer of 1816, the Northern Hemisphere didn't really have a summer. The weather was shitty, it rained a lot in places it shouldn't have rained. The summer was just ruined. And on Lake Geneva, a place called Villa Diodati, Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley were vacationing in this villa and got bored because the weather was so shittily horrible that they couldn't find anything to do. They couldn't go for walks, they couldn't go boating. The whole plans were ruined. And so they started writing stories for each other. And that's where we get Frankenstein from. So if it wasn't for a volcano blowing up in Indonesia, Frankenstein would not exist. Unforeseen consequences. And that brings me to the subject of this video. I'm going to look at the two biggest Frankenstein adaptations. 1931 Universal Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff and Colin Clive, and the 1957 The Curse of Frankenstein, Hammer's first big horror movie starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. I'm going to compare and contrast the two. They're very different films. They came into existence 26 years apart. Very different parts of the world, very different times, but both of them launched a wave of horror films. Universal horror wouldn't exist if it were for Frankenstein and Dracula. Hammer horror probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the mad success of The Curse of Frankenstein. Now, looked at in modern terms, neither of these movies hits really big as scary. But in 1931 and 1957, they were. In fact, Frankenstein was so scary that in 1932, the government of South Australia banned it for being too scary for South Australians. And by sheer coincidence, Adelaide, the capital of South Australia, became the serial killer capital of Australia. Is there cause and effect there? I don't know. The other thing that happened as far as Frankenstein movies and Australia is concerned is, between 1948 and 1968, horror movies were banned in Australia. It would have been shit to have been a kid then. Couldn't watch horror movies, you had to watch Pat Boone movies and Beach Blanket Bingo. Not good enough. But in 1968 they made things better. So, leaving that aside, so first I'm going to do the 1931 version, not the first version of the story done, that was done in 1910, but it's the one that everybody remembers and everybody regards fondly. It's arguably one of the most artistic and arthousey of the Frankenstein movies, directed by James Whale, a gay man from the north of England who ended up being a prisoner of war during World War I and moved to Hollywood. He'd done some successful plays, he directed and written some successful plays, and then went to Hollywood and started making movies. The version I got for this one is 8 of the original Frankenstein movies. That one, I've got that version of it, which I like. It's on Blu-ray, there's tons of extras on it. The 1931 Frankenstein is the one that everybody thinks of instinctively when people mention the word Frankenstein. And of course, yes, Frankenstein is the monster because he created a monster and he basically abused his creation. So Victor Frankenstein is the monster. The creature is the result of that monstrosity. I'm going with that belief. Because in both of these versions of the story, the true monster is Victor Frankenstein. The 1931 version starts out a little preciously. They're a little bit wary about it. So they get Edward Van Sloan, one of the actors who plays Dr. Waldman, to come out from behind a curtain, just like it was a theatre, and talk directly to the audience, breaking the fourth wall before the movie even starts. He says the producer, Carl Lemery, wants people to know that this is a movie about horror. This is a movie about somebody challenging God. This is a movie about hubris and monstrosity. And just be aware of that, even though outside the building where they're showing the movie, there's an enormous Frankenstein monster. A little bit self-conscious there, but that's what they ended up doing. And for me, I don't think it's necessary. I suppose as a way of calming the senses and the people who are going to criticize the movie for its horrible subject matter, getting a revered character actor out the front, telling people that this is going to scare the shit out of you right from the very start, was probably a way of calming down those senses, even though a lot of places banned it and they asked for enormous cuts to it and all sorts of other things occurred based on the fact that this is a movie about somebody jigsawing together a corpse and resurrecting it. and then having shit go wrong. It just feels odd. So the movie starts with a bit of a grotesque joke by Jimmy Whale, where there's a funeral in a very stylized graveyard, and the camera pans across the faces of the mourners and the grave diggers, and then goes to a statue of the ghost of death that happens to be part of the architecture of the graveyard. A little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I appreciated it. And behind a wrought iron fence are Victor Frankenstein and Fritz, his hunchback assistant, played by Dwight Fry, just waiting for everybody to finish the funeral so they can dig up the corpse and salvage what they need from it. A little bit disrespectful. At least go to the wake and get yourself a sandwich and a beer. Both of these versions of Frankenstein follow through on my belief that rich people are the worst, because Victor Frankenstein his father's a baron. He's living off his father's money. He's gone away and found himself a nice little mill where he can do his experiments and resurrect things and create life where life didn't exist. He's a total nutcase. He's red flagged all over the place, but his fiancée Elizabeth, for reasons unknown to anybody, loves him. We also get another character played by John Bowles, who's in love with Elizabeth and is sitting around waiting for her. It's one of those weird tropes. I find it really weird in cinema, where you get the guy who's actually in love with the main female character and hangs around in the hope that she's going to realize that the guy she's really in love with is a bastard and fall into his arms. You can't live your life like that. It just makes you creepy. But we've got that character in the movie. The character I like most in this movie, apart from the creature, is Frederick Kerr's Baron, the father of Victor Frankenstein, who's grumpy and silly and avuncular and a lot of fun. As the wedding of Victor and Elizabeth gets close, he gives booze to all of the servants. The whole village is going to have a party. He's grumpy but avuncular, and him you could probably sit down and have a beer with. But nobody else in this movie did I like very much. So we have Elizabeth, played by Mae Clarke, who is the fiancée of Victor Frankenstein, and is the last thing he's thinking of. He's thinking about putting bits and pieces together to make a man. Is that gay? I don't know. You spend all of your time sewing todgers onto corpses. You may have to consider that your sexuality may be other than mainstream. Who knows? I'm not going to dive into that one too deeply. So Victor's ignoring his fiancée Elizabeth. We get Edward Van Sloan playing Dr. Waldman, who is a mentor and teacher to Victor Frankenstein. So he does try to give a reality check to Victor, saying you have an insane ambition to create life and you're doing it in the wrong way. There's another way to do it. You're doing it the wrong way. So we know about the brain, where Fritz gets the wrong brain. He gets an abnormal brain instead of a normal brain from the university labs and takes it in so that Victor can tuck it into Boris Karloff's skull. It's a very 1930s kind of idea that there are physically abnormal brains and physically not abnormal brains, and one means you're going to be a good person and one means you're not going to be a good person. Those ideas are a little bit sus to me. So we get Kenneth Strickfaden's wonderful lab apparatus, and I found out today that the Tesla coil used in that was actually made by Nikola Tesla before his name was dragged through the mud by Elon Musk. So that's kind of cool. The original Frankenstein has some stuff that was botched together by Nikola Tesla. Thumbs up for that. That machinery was used most recently in Young Frankenstein in 1974, by the way. So Fritz and Victor wait for the thunderstorm, have the body on the slab, lift it up in an elevator, up into the sky, have it hit by lightning, bring it back down, and Boris Karloff monster gets animated. Every time I watch this film, I am so in love with Boris Karloff's physical acting. Boris Karloff had an unusual bone structure. He was Anglo-Indian, I think from a grandparent, and he looked different from just an ordinary Englishman for that reason. That gauntness, that bony face that he had, which lent itself so well to Jack Pierce's makeup, was just exactly what the movie needed. And then on top of that, you get the physical acting, the heavy boots, the short sleeves on the jacket, the padding in the jacket that make his shoulders look so much bigger. And then Karloff's physical acting. The way even just when the hand first twitches, Karloff's long hands and just that first instinctive movement tells you that there's something beyond normal going on here. And then when the creature moves, that forward-leaning slant that it has, and the way he lurches around, and moves in a way as if his nervous system is playing catch up with the different parts of his body is incredible. I don't think I've ever seen physical acting quite like that. The only other thing I can compare it to as far as next level physical acting in a monster role is Vincent D'Onofrio in Men in Black playing the bug inside the man's skin. There's an incredible artistry to the way both of those actors move in those two different roles. Karloff's motion and the way Karloff reacts to things, he notices things about a beat or two after somebody else without his problems and without his origin would notice them. He doesn't notice the torch that Fritz brings towards him for a beat or two, whereas anybody else who was scared of fire would notice it immediately. His nervous system is on delay, and that makes him creepier than he would be otherwise. And I totally love that. I think it's a genius move between Karloff and James Whale to have the creature react that way. All of his bits don't fit together, and his physicality in this movie reflects that. Then we get to one of the other scenes that people talk about a lot, where he meets the little girl Maria by the side of the lake and they start playing with the flowers. In the cut version that I first saw of this movie back in the day, they cut away before the creature throws Maria into the river thinking she'll float like the flowers do. And then his confusion and his distress when he realizes, what do I do? What do I do? I'm a child. And he does have a child's reactions to things. Something's gone wrong. I've done something wrong. What do I do? I run away. Those reactions, all of that stuff's missing from the version I first saw of this film. And it gives an implication that something much worse than that occurred to kill little Maria. Something that even in this day you wouldn't see in a movie. And that skews the narrative away from us being sympathetic to the creature, which is where our sympathy should be. The creature is a child. They were brought into the world against their will, just the way children are. And people are throwing all these arbitrary rules at it that we don't understand. It's being bullied by Fritz the way that schoolyard bullies do. And so the creature is, in pretty much every way except physically, a child. And Karloff and Whale give us that. And apart from anything else, I love the production design of this, the slightly abstract, influenced by the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, obviously. The set designs of the lab and the mill are fantastic. They do a lot. The sets are tall in this movie, including the set for the Baron's mansion. The ceilings are incredibly high, and it kind of gives us a gothic structure to even just the Baron's household. And of course, the creature crashes the wedding, and we find Elizabeth prone on, is it prone or supine? We find Elizabeth prone on the bed, as if she'd been ravished by the creature. And obviously she hadn't. She's just had a reaction to seeing an animated corpse break in. And she isn't injured by it, but she's kind of gone into a little bit of a hysterical thing there. And of course, Victor Frankenstein thinks the worst of the creature. And there's another scene of the father carrying Maria's body through the town as the people in the town are celebrating Victor and Elizabeth's wedding. And people falling silent as they realize what's happening. And he takes the body of his daughter right up to the burgomaster and tells her that somebody has killed his child. He doesn't have any evidence of that happened. In its strict sense, I suppose the creature did kill her, but it wasn't a malicious and intentional one. It was more death by misadventure in a sense. And then all the pitchforks and torches come out, and they break the people of the town into 3 groups so they can search for whoever killed Maria. But there's no actual evidence that she was murdered. As far as they knew, she might have fallen into the lake. There's no evidence that somebody threw her into the lake even. And one of the other things I noticed really interestingly is the way Colin Clive's Victor Frankenstein. Colin Clive is just all nerves in this as Frankenstein. The way Frankenstein refers to his creation. Right up until the time the creature breaks into Elizabeth's bedroom, it is referred to as it. It's always it. And then after the creature has gone into Elizabeth's bedroom and she passes out on her chaise longue, it becomes he. Suddenly, Victor Frankenstein genders his creation, which is an interesting turn of events if you look at it in a certain way. It's almost as if up until that point, the creature has been, in a sense, abstract, and then suddenly it becomes gendered and male to Victor Frankenstein. Really interesting way of language is using that. Then, of course, they all go to the mill and the creature and Frankenstein confront one another at the top of the mill, and the creature throws Frankenstein off the mill. He catches onto one of the windmill sails and falls to the ground, and he's injured, but he's not dead. And the villagers decide to burn down a historic building because there's someone in there they don't like. We of course know what happens in the sequel, where he falls through the mill and into the water and all that kind of jazz. But as far as this movie is concerned, there's a lot of taking the law into your own hands that goes on here. But again, Karloff is magnificent in it. Frederick Kerr playing the Baron is fantastic. And that edge that Colin Clive has as Victor Frankenstein, where he's on the verge of hysteria for most of the movie. And Colin Clive was blackout drunk, and he was drunk for part of the filming of that. And unfortunately, it ended in him dying quite early. And then Dwight Fry, who doesn't get a lot of time, but uses it to give us a malicious troll of a human being in Fritz. But Jimmy Wales' direction, the production design, Kenneth Strickfaden's machinery, Boris Karloff, fantastic stuff. It's classic for a reason. Doesn't outstay its welcome to. It's not a particularly long film, but it's wonderful. And of course it did, along with Dracula, lead to a whole bunch of Universal films where they were doing horror films unlike anything anybody else is doing. The Wolfman. And then in the 1950s, of course, we had the creature from the Black Lagoon. But you got the Wolfman, you got the Invisible Man, you got Frankenstein, you got Dracula. You got all of those things that are, even to this very day, there's a attraction at the new Universal theme park in Florida, which uses all of these creatures to scare and delight people right to this very day. But then we get to the 1950s, we've got a very different world. Colour film is more prevalent, and in England, Hammer decides it's going to do a horror movie. Milton Subotsky gives them the idea of doing a version of Frankenstein. They've been doing crime films and comedies and a bit of science fiction and a little bit of horror, but they haven't really been diving deep into it. And then they decide to do Curse of Frankenstein. They get a guy who'd been mostly working on TV up to that point, Peter Cushing, to star in it as his first starring role. And they've got to find somebody to play the monster. They want a tall actor, preferably skinny, but just a tall actor to do this. And they're dithering between two people. Bernard Bresslaw, who's 6'7", good actor. We only see him in comedies really, but he was actually a good stage actor as well, was in the lead to play the monster. And the other person was Christopher Lee, who'd been jobbing around as an actor since the 1940s, had a very interesting World War II experience or two. And so they're kind of working out who they're going to get to play the monster. Bernard Bresslaw wanted 10 quid a day. Christopher Lee wanted 8 quid a day. So they went with Christopher Lee, even though he was 2 or 3 inches shorter. Would have been interesting to pop to an alternate universe to see how Bernard Bresslaw would have played the creature in The Curse of Frankenstein had he got the role. Because I think he would have done a good job. And he would have done a very different job than Christopher Lee did. My version of this comes out of the Hammer Horror Collection, which is well over 20 years old now. This has House of Dracula, The Curse of Frankenstein, and The Mummy. This box set. I'm not going to take it out because, actually I will. There's Christopher Lee's Frankenstein's monster. So we're in a very different cinematic world in the 1950s. The original version, the 1931 Frankenstein, of course, was pre-code. And so it could show edgier things like bits of corpses and men being cut down off gibbets to give body parts and things like that. But America had gone soft since then with the production code. And England had a little looser censorship. So there's something going to make it in colour. They make it at Bray Studios, the headquarters of Hammer Films at the time. And they've got their 2 leads. They got Peter Cushing, aristocratic, receive pronunciation voice, playing Victor Frankenstein. To play his friend and mentor Paul, they've got Robert Urquhart, a Scottish stage actor. To play Elizabeth, they got Hazel Court, who does a magnificent job of it and gives us a much more complex Elizabeth than we got with May Clark. And at the start of the film, we get a teenage Victor Frankenstein, played by Melvin Hayes, who later turned up in 8.5 Hot Mum and a number of other things. It was about 1.5 foot shorter than Peter Cushing. So between the ages of 15 and 25, Victor Frankenstein had a hell of a growth spurt. So Victor and his tutor Paul get together and spend 10 years dicking around and try to find ways to bring dead things back to life. And they do. And we see a scene where Victor and Paul resurrect a puppy A nice little doggo is in a tank full of water. It gets all the chemicals pumped into it. They use electricity to resurrect it, and the doggo comes back to life. And by the way, that little puppy was actually adopted by Robert Urquhart, who plays Paul. You can see the dog and him are getting it along really well when it's resurrected. All credit to him for that. So I like the fact that the little doggo got a home. But Victor wants to take it further. He doesn't want to just resurrect the dead, because anybody can do that. He wants to create a new being. He wants to put together a patchwork one. He wants to Voltron a body and create his own person. So him and Paul's getting a little reluctant about this because Victor's going a little further than Paul wants to, go out and cut a body down from the gibbet and take it back and go, oh, I can't use the head. The crows have picked the eyes out of it and half of the face is missing and half of the head's been chewed off by birds. Let's cut off the head, says Victor. And they cut off the head and drop it into a great big vat of acid they have conveniently there for the end of the movie. So they've got to find a head, they've got to find eyes. And meanwhile, a grown-up Elizabeth, who Victor had known, and is actually his cousin, so there's a little bit of incest there, but where isn't there, comes to live with them because her mother has died, who is Victor's aunt. Victor had been giving them a stipend so they could live. So Elizabeth comes in and it's Hazel Court, beautiful actress, beautiful woman. Paul falls in love with her immediately, but there's a little more agency to Paul falling in love with her, and she feels obligated because of the arranged marriage idea that she's got to marry Victor, even though she doesn't particularly love him. She makes every effort to get to know him, but Victor's not interested in her because Victor has a thing going with Justine the maid, played by Valerie Gaunt, and him and her are getting it on. And even though he does have a fiance, him and her continue to get it on because he's a player. So all the usual things happens. Victor goes to a carnival house to get a couple of eyeballs from the Undertaker, fresh ones, so he can put them into his monster. And we see him getting the eyeballs and doing a deal with the guy and then popping the eyeballs into a jar full of preservative fluid. A little bit more of that kind of stuff in this movie than there would be in, say, the previous film. We see him getting a couple of decent hands. You get to see the chopped off hands he's been carrying around his valise for a couple of days. And he puts together his monster in a giant fish tank. Victor doesn't pay attention very much because the monster resurrects without him being around. And the monster lurches around. We see him through a doorway first. And then we get an undercranked zoom in too. The creature as he removes the bandages from his own face. And we've got Christopher Lee. Now, the makeup Christopher Lee has as the creature is very different than the Universal makeup because they weren't allowed to use that. And the makeup was mostly bits of tissue, bits and pieces, just applied daily to Christopher Lee's face. They did a whole makeup every day fresh. They tried to use a mask of Christopher Lee and then apply the makeup to that with rubber and do it that way, but it didn't work. And the guy they had to do it got sacked because he couldn't make it work. And then they got somebody else to come in and do fresh makeup every day, just applied bit by bit with tissue paper and paint and makeup to Christopher Lee's face. It's kind of effective. It's pale as if it's not getting enough blood circulation. There's lots of scar tissue. There's a cloudy eye. There's a big scar on the head anyway. And he's got a kind of proto-Beatles haircut. I'll be honest with you, Christopher Lee isn't as good at being Frankenstein's monster as Boris Karloff was. He does the physicality and he does it okay. Not great, but okay. He does it well enough. But I wasn't particularly impressed with it. I think it's a good bit of acting, but Christopher Lee, when he can't use that wonderful, deep Christopher Lee voice and can't use many facial expressions because the bits of makeup will fall off, is Christopher Lee with his hands tied behind his back as far as being an actor is concerned. There are some very effective scare moments where you see him lurching through a forest and he encounters a little boy and his blind grandfather who are hiking. And we never find out what happens to them after they encounter him. There's no payoff to that scene, apart from the fact that it was a slight reference to the scene with Maria in the 1931 Frankenstein, because the little boy's seen playing at the edge of a lake, or at least a river. But nothing pays off for that, which is a shame. And then Paul shoots the creature in the eye. They think it's dead. They take it back to the lab. Victor hangs it up on a hook like a slab of meat, and it resurrects itself again. And then Victor does brain surgery on it and ends up with a moron monster. He's got a big scar on his head. He's uncoordinated even more than he was previously, and that's where Christopher Lee picks up his game as far as the physical acting is concerned. And the movie plays out to its end. But the weird thing about the movie is there's a frame story around all of this narrative. At the start of the film, we see Victor Frankenstein in prison. He's about to be executed by guillotine, and he tells a priest his story. And then later on, Paul comes and visits him, and there's no evidence left that the creature existed, and Paul doesn't admit the creature exists, and Victor Frankenstein goes to the guillotine. But in the next movie, his head's put back on his body so they can continue the series. But the hammer, Curse of Frankenstein, isn't as iconically wonderful as the original, I keep saying the original, but as the 1931 version of it. But it is something of its own. The script was by Jimmy Sangster, who was good at this kind of thing, and putting in the different love relationships as subtext in the movie was kind of interesting. It fleshes out the character of Victor Frankenstein a lot, and having Paul, the friend and mentor of Victor, fall in love with Victor's actual fiance works well as well, because Victor's simply not that interested in her. He's busy stripping the maid. So that emotional complexity and relationship complexity works for those characters. The creature comes in fairly late in the piece as well. So I'm not sure it works. It's a good script. This is Hammer learning how to do monster movies. It's not Hammer experienced to doing monster movies as it was as we phased into the 1960s. And as they learned into things like the Dracula stuff. I enjoyed the film. Good to see Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing in their first real roles together. And it's a movie that started their friendship as well. They became friends while they were making this film. So it's important from that history of Hammer horror films. Even though it did tremendously well and gave Hammer the impetus to make all the movies it made subsequent to that, it's still not a strong piece of horror cinema. And I think Christopher Lee was much better when he was given dialogue. And there is that joke that Christopher Lee went to Peter Cushing and said, I don't have any dialogue in this. And Peter Cushing said, I've read the script, you haven't missed out anything. Still, it is the start of Hammer's incredible success, which lasted well into the 1970s, of making genre films and making them well and making them in vivid colour and making them with body parts and a lot more confronting than the movies that were being made by, say, American studios. So that's what I got for you this time around. A compare and contrast between the two versions of Frankenstein. I enjoyed watching them both. I watched one of them last night. I watched the original 1931. See, I said the original again. The 1931 version last night. And I watched The Curse of Frankenstein this morning. I had a great time with both of them. I think they're good to double feature. The second one's always going to pale in comparison to the first, even though the first is in black and white. So thanks a lot for watching. Usual things, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you think. You can also hit the notification bell. And if you really want to help the channel, you can become a channel member, or you can become a patron at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. Next up, we've got the Wednesday video, and I've got some ideas for that. And people have given me the idea, actually I started the idea, but people ran with it and liked, of doing only art house films for 1 month. I may do it in May, I may do it in June when things get cold and miserable. But I can still do genre films. I'll do art house science fiction movies for Science Fiction Saturday and art house movies for other times. Let me know what you think again, because I'm getting a lot of good feedback on that. So anyway, until all that happens and everything else happens, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Watch a couple of Frankenstein movies. You're not going to go wrong, and you don't have to worry about following the plot too much. And I'll catch you next time.